I think his golden hour, his hour of fame and glory, would have still resonated in history whether he'd died or whether he'd lived.
Without that personality there, you're thinking, how do the dry as dust Foreign Office and the Dominion Office and the Colonial Office actually deal with this?
He walks around the White House in the nude and says to Roosevelt, the Prime Minister of Britain has got nothing to hide from the President of the United States.
That sort of ruthless decision is made by Churchill alone. Nobody else makes that decision. So he needs to be there for that. And you look at, he is the man of the hour. You know, at any other time, he might not have been the right person, but he is at this point. And he drags the Americans across.
What was more likely, I think, to remove Churchill was the Grim Reaper himself.
Yeah.
Churchill was a lifelong heavy drinker, smoked cigars, as we know, smoked like a chimney, drank like a fish. He was a stranger to the gym, took next to no exercise, was small, fat and corpulent. And
well, he says nice things about you, though, Nigel.
Indeed. A life well lived, I'm sure you could argue.
But he had an iron constitution and he lived to be 90 years old.
For Britain at least, 1940 represents a defining moment of the Second World War. The Nazi blitzkrieg had moved through Europe in a flash and driven British forces off the continent. Later that year, while the streets across major cities lay empty, bombs rained from the skies above as the Blitz caused catastrophic damage. Yet Britain would not go down quietly. And perhaps the most significant event was one man taking up the position of Prime Minister and wartime leader, one Winston Churchill. Of course, he would go on to lead the nation through the remainder of the war, but it was not without incident. There were moments of disquiet, failure, and even ill health. So where might we be had Churchill been taken out of the equation? I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode, we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's the Second World War and the man who took Britain to victory. Winston Churchill is remembered as a historical titan. Yet what if this lasting legacy had not come to pass? Could he have been ousted during the war? Could he even have been killed? These are questions for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Parry, and returning to the channel, the historian and journalist Nigel Jones. Welcome to you both. Now, we have in front of us, as we so often do on History Undone, our favourite large-scale map of Europe circa 1940. Now, in this episode, we're going to be talking about a lot of counterfactuals, jumping around all over the place. But let's start here in northern France. With the fall of France, you get D-Day, you get the cabinet crisis, of course, in London. Now, this is something that we've covered before in this programme. You two gentlemen have even covered it ourselves. We won't retread too much ground. But Chris, is it fair to say, in asking whether Churchill could have been ousted or even died, this might be where our story begins?
Certainly, and I think what we have to mention, of course, is that Churchill is in power because of a disastrous Norway campaign by the Chamberlain government. Whether or not Chamberlain himself was to blame for that, or Churchill as well, to tell you the truth, it was all a bit mixed up. But there was a real sort of atmosphere of discontent with the Chamberlain government, and there were large numbers of Tories who basically wanted a change. The Labour Party didn't particularly like Chamberlain, so that was always going to be a problem in a wartime government. And long and the short of it is there was a coup. Churchill found his way into number 10 and immediately took over direction of the war. And one of the really controversial issues, of course, with Churchill is he decided to be Prime Minister and basically running the strategic side of the war as well, his own Minister of Defence, if you like. And this comes into play later in 1942. But immediately, Churchill starts trying to keep France in the war, and he shuttles across by air. And as Nigel and I have spoken just before the programme, any time, I think he shuttled 8 times, Nigel, across?
6 times. But,
6, yeah. Could have been shot down any time in a war zone, and he could have been straight out of the game. The other thing I think it's worth bearing in mind is that not everybody in the Conservative Party, by a long way, is happy with Churchill being Prime Minister. And they talk about him and his clique being gangsters. They talk about reptilian satellites. I mean, it's really quite strong.
Yeah.
So all the while he's trying to keep France in the game. The Conservative Party is waking up to what they've got here. They're not quite sure. They know Churchill's record from the First World War. He's been a constant irritant to the party during the 1930s. But he has consistently opposed Germany. That's the key point. But we shouldn't be under any illusions. Chamberlain thinks he can make a comeback. And there are a lot of discontented Conservatives who are not prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt at this stage.
And Nigel, Chris has almost teased it there. Between sort of May and June, as we say, Churchill kind of makes these flights over the Channel towards France. I think by the end of June, the RAF has already lost around 100 aircraft at this point. So it's by no means a sure thing that is a safe flight.
It was a reckless thing to do, but it is a measure of Churchill's courage, reckless courage, that he did it. I mean, he could have been a casualty of war at that point, and there's no doubt in my mind that the whole history of the war would have been different had he been shot down on that occasion.
Yeah, and at this point in 1940, the obvious successor, I think you two might disagree on this slightly, is Lord Halifax.
Well, I think Halifax thinks so. That's the first thing. I mean, we shouldn't discount a Chamberlain comeback, actually. I think quite a lot of people had sort of buyer's regret almost straight away in the Conservative Party. The key issue is that the Labour Party under Attlee will not work with Chamberlain again.
Yeah.
They actually set their face against it. So that's what really stops it happening. But the plotting continues at this stage. And if there'd been a maladroit move straight away by Churchill, or indeed Churchill had gone down, I think the obvious successor is Halifax at this point. Remember, we haven't quite lost in the West yet, so Halifax comes to the fore later. I think my own view about it is it's up for grabs, actually. There's quite a few people who could have actually stepped up. Sir John Simon, for example, he's a likely person. They've all faded into the background because of the way history's gone at the moment, but there were a number of people who could have stepped forward.
The crucial thing is that Churchill wanted the prize. All his life, as he said when he took it up, had been a preparation for this hour. And Halifax, frankly, didn't want it. He was an aristocrat. He was a member of the House of Lords. That was quite important. He couldn't face the House of Commons to explain what was going on in the war. He was crippled. He had a withered arm. He was interested in country sports, in hunting, shooting, the Anglican Church. And he wasn't really a man of the 20th century. He was a man of the 19th century. And he was offered it on a plate. Chamberlain wanted him to be Prime Minister. The King wanted him to be Prime Minister. Most MPs wanted him to be Prime Minister. And he turned it down. He said he had a stomachache.
He didn't think he was up to it. No. And he feared actually having Churchill in the cabinet.
As his minister.
So there was a problem there. So he actually deferred to Churchill in that sense.
Yeah. And Churchill then gives him a role. He becomes ambassador to the US.
Initially, he stays as foreign secretary, but Churchill sees he's a problem.
Yeah.
So he says, I've got to get rid of Halifax because, the discontents are actually sort of rallying around Halifax. And Halifax, of course, once the French are heading towards surrender, starts saying, well, we should talk to Mussolini. Yeah. We need to get terms. It's much better if we keep our empire and leave Europe to the Nazis and all this sort of thing. And, of course, Churchill is dead set against that. And by October 1940, he's found a role for him in the state. He doesn't want to go. He can't stand the Americans. He thinks they're vulgar. And the prospect of being in Washington appalls him. Yeah. But eventually he's convinced he has to go.
OK, Nigel, so then if we go through 1940, we'll get to the Blitz in just a second, but you also have the Battle of Britain, and you have that famous speech, never has so much been owed by so many to so few.
Well, there's fighting on the beaches and all that sort of thing as well,
Yeah. Is there a sense that however long that goes on, could the public and those close to him be fed up and oust him there if things aren't?
Rather, I think the public fell in love with Churchill at this point because of his oratory, because of his determination that Britain would not surrender, would not make any terms, would not go for a deal in the Trump sense of the word, but would fight on whatever the odds. He said to his own cabinet, this war will not end till we lie on the ground choking in our own blood. That was how, and he conveyed that sense of determination to resist to the public through his famous radio addresses.
It's very hard to imagine today, at least in Britain,
Yeah.
a politician getting their message across quite as well.
Almost impossible.
As that.
Well, the other interesting thing is, can you imagine Halifax trying to get that message across?
No.
I mean, no other politician could be, I think, as sort of effective as that in actually galvanising the kingdom. And one of the things from a previous episode, it's worth mentioning, I think, is the fact that Britain didn't think it was going to lose.
Yeah.
So he was able to, if you like, enhance that sort of view that we can't lose. You know, we're safe here in our island kingdom, and I think that had he not been there, we would almost certainly have approached Mussolini and said, "Talk to Hitler, will you, and see what's going on."
Absolutely.
Does he
I
also
totally
have,
agree.
this question for both of you, does he also have that safety net that once Halifax doesn't want it,
Yeah.
are there other people close to him thinking there's no one else that's actually up to the job?
Well, Chamberlain is still there.
He's ageing.
He's ill. I mean, that's the key point. That doesn't come out until just before the Battle of Britain. But Chamberlain is still hankering to come back again. That's the point. And there is a significant amount of the Tory party that actually wants him back.
But the Labour Party doesn't
The
want
Labour
him.
Party
and
absolutely
there
don't
was a
want him back.
coalition national government. You had to have the Labour Party on side, and that was Chamberlain's fatal handicap, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why it wasn't going to happen. But they're still plotting behind the scenes. That's the point.
OK, now let's get to a little bit of the fun part. So we'll talk about the Blitz here. There is actually a bomb in October 1940 which falls on Treasury Gardens, very, very close to Downing Street. But at this point, Churchill is not sort of living in his war rooms. He is still in Downing Street. So that is potentially
Fergus,
a place there where, you know, could Churchill have died in the Blitz?
well, there's another one actually. Chequers is wide open initially. They don't actually put any defences around Chequers. And in fact, the lead-in features, and I've seen it from the air, actually are fantastic for actually going and bombing Chequers. And so the Germans knew he was out of town sometimes. And in fact, they had to put quite significant measures in terms of, they put a lot of soldiers in there at one stage, but also some air defences as well. So he could have been done in Chequers as well as in central
As
London.
well as his country home, Chartwell in Kent, was actually on the bomb run into London.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of out as well. I mean, Churchill was a brave man, and eventually he found a country house, I think it's called Ditchley Manor, owned by an MP called Ronald Tree, who was one of his few supporters in the Conservative Party, who lent it to him as his country home because, as Chris said, Chequers was found to be too dangerous. There was a big white drive leading up to it, which in the end they had to cover with turf to disguise it from the Luftwaffe.
It's here.
Pointy. But and
it's an 8-month-long bombing campaign.
Yes.
It's far more rudimentary than now. There's no GPS. I mean, he could have been caught up in the bombing.
And he very often would appear in the streets after a particularly severe raid to show his face among the people, if you like, to show that he was on their side and with them and also in danger from them. And the next year, in May 1941, the House of Commons was completely destroyed in a raid. I mean, bombing affected all classes. If you were upper class, it was no defence. Buckingham Palace was bombed. Downing Street, as you said, or the Treasury was bombed. So they were in danger. And that was one of the great equalisers of the war, that everyone was in it.
Yes.
The other thing is Churchill had a habit of going up on top of the roof in Whitehall and watching the raids at night as well. I mean, so, No, I mean, he exposed himself. But, you know, I always say to people, look at the number of times Hitler nearly was assassinated. You know, these leaders actually were out in front most of the time, making themselves available to their publics.
OK, those are some of the key events from the beginning of the war. Let's zoom out now and focus on some more moments from around the world that could have seen Winston Churchill removed. OK, welcome back. Now we have a new map. This is a world map we've got in front of us this time. Now, this is actually from late 1942. So, of course, you'll see America here is blue, joined on the Allied side. But some other areas we're going to be talking about in this section. We have Crete and also North Africa. We have Singapore. We'll be talking a little about Pearl Harbor and, of course, Barbarossa as well. So let's start. Let's get into 1941, Nigel. How do some of Winston Churchill's actions take us through the year in 1941?
Well, In early 1941, Britain has withstood the Blitz and survived the Blitz, following on from victory in the Battle of Britain in 1940. So by the middle of 1941, Britain is blooded but unbowed still. And then in June 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union. Actually, he'd been delayed. He should have invaded 5 weeks earlier. But thanks to a British organised coup in Yugoslavia, which brought a pro-Allied government to power, he had to deal with the Balkans. He then invaded Yugoslavia, invaded Greece, and finally Crete, and took them over. So that very much delayed the invasion, Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Churchill, a lifelong anti-communist who advocated armed intervention against the Russian Revolution, dropped all that in an instant and famously said, if Hitler had invaded hell, I would have made a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. He immediately offered Russia British support and welcomed Russia as an immensely powerful ally.
And indirectly, that kind of takes a little bit of the heat off Winston Churchill about Barbarossa.
We weren't alone anymore. We had this hugely powerful ally, de facto ally, not an ideological, but a practical ally in the shape of Stalin's Russia.
And then, Chris, of course, you also get Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that, of course, ever since he's been Prime Minister, it's worth remembering also, of course, that Winston Churchill is half American. He's got a fantastic relationship going with Roosevelt. Roosevelt is very clear-eyed about it. It's America's interest here. But he does not want to have to face Nazi Germany later. And quite a lot of what the Nazis are saying is, once we've sorted out Europe, we're going to have a look at America to see what threat they constitute. So he knows that he's going to have to take on the Nazis at some stage. So he wants to keep Britain in the fight. What convinces the Americans that Britain will stay in the fight is when, of course, the Royal Navy destroys the French fleet at Mersa el-Kabir. And the Americans immediately say they mean it. And so then you start to see the start of Lend-Lease. You see 50 old destroyers lent to the Royal Navy, and the Battle of the Atlantic, which is pretty vicious in 1941. U-boats are ranging far and near, just about holding their own, the Allies in that sense. The Americans have started creating safety zones, as they call them, and security zones in the North Atlantic. You're seeing engagements between American destroyers and U-boats. So you can see the war creeping ever closer. And towards the end of the year, of course, America is putting pressure on Japan in relation to its policy over China, Manchuria in particular. And of course, it culminates in Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And of course, as soon as that happens, America's in the war. But critically, 5 days later, of course, Germany declares war on the United States. They don't have to.
A mistake that we've covered on History Undone.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think that was down to a fireside chat by Roosevelt, who said, look, it's not just Japan we're in the war with, it's Germany. And if you recall from our episode, Goebbels famously said, you know, great powers don't have war declared on them, so we're going to declare war on the United States. And that's what happens. And so in a trice, Churchill has got the Americans in against not just Japan, but against Germany, something they've discussed before. The only problem is to try and forestall what might happen in the Far East, Churchill has authorised the dispatch of HMS Prince of Wales, a battleship, and Repulse, a battle cruiser. They should have gone with an aircraft carrier, but it went aground, so it couldn't go with them. They go out, and shortly after Pearl Harbor, they're both sunk off Malaya. And this is a real disaster from a PR point of view.
How does that go down back home?
Not well with a lot of MPs, although the actual danger to Churchill is not hugely great at this particular point. But it's worth bearing in mind that up to this point, we had only won defensive victories, i.e. the Battle of Britain and withstanding the Blitz. The only victory that we had was not against Germany, but was against the Italians in North Africa, a battle called Sidi Berani, in which thousands and thousands of Italians were captured and trooped into captivity, not unwillingly in long lines. But once we came up against the Afrika Korps of Rommel, that was a very different issue. And so up to that point, up to well after the middle of the war, Britain had not won a offensive military victory against Germany.
Nigel, I'm going to have to tell you, we've got the Battle of Cape Matapan, we've sunk the Bismarck, and we've also sunk the Graf Spee by this stage.
I'm talking really about land.
You are talking about land battles.
OK, you're quite right. As a naval man, thank you for reminding me of that.
Before we move into 1942, which is probably the most perilous year for Churchill, just a note on Roosevelt. That relationship obviously is very strong. Britain still just about has a special relationship with America today. Is that also key for Churchill's longevity, that he does sort of hold Roosevelt's ear so well?
Yes, but as Chris mentioned, America, from Roosevelt down to Trump, always puts American interest before anything else, before any sentimental alliance in the old country and English-speaking peoples and all that, which Churchill was very keen on. Roosevelt wasn't so keen. In fact, one of Roosevelt's long-term goals was to abolish the British Empire. He was anti-colonialism. There was a huge amount of anti-English prejudice in America from German minorities, Irish minorities, Italian minorities possibly, and Churchill had to win Roosevelt over, perhaps against Roosevelt's own better interests. He'd met Churchill once when they were both naval ministers in the First World War, and they hadn't got on. They were not personal, close friends, but the interests of their two countries were aligned, and therefore they saw their alliance.
And he has a certain charm.
Yeah, but also Churchill went across the Atlantic quite a lot by sea or by air to make sure this relationship worked throughout. But as we get into 1942, we're taking a bit of a beating here in the Far East. Churchill is looking at this and he thinks, I need a vote of confidence. Mm-hmm. But what happens after that? He gets the vote of confidence, he engineers it himself, and it's something like 475 to 1 in the Commons. So he doesn't lose that. But he does that deliberately because all this is kicking off and he thinks he needs that. So that's self-engineered. But then we have a few disasters.
We do. Please get into those disasters.
The first thing that happens, and this seems to annoy people more than anything else that happens in the early 1942, is the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, two German battleships, or battle cruisers, depending how you categorise them, and also the Prince Eugen, a heavy cruiser, do what is known as the Channel Dash from the west of France all the way home to Germany. And the coordination involved in detecting them and attacking them fails spectacularly. And if you look at Chips Channon's diaries, he says, I don't know when the British public have been more angry than when this happened. So that's in February 1942. This is then followed by a disastrous campaign in Malaya, where the Japanese sweep down the Malay Peninsula and capture Singapore, along with over 130,000 Imperial and British troops. So that happens in February. So you're actually rocking from this. In North Africa, General Ritchie is defeated by Rommel at Gazala and is pushed back to Tobruk. Tobruk falls under the weight of the Luftwaffe attack to a German army that is half the size of the garrison. And at this time, Churchill's talking about, it's not just a defeat, it's a disgrace. We're fed up with this. Meanwhile, in the Far East, we're losing Burma. And then finally, Tobruk falls itself, and Rommel can then sweep further on. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Atlantic's not going that well at this stage because you've got increased numbers of U-boats. And by July, there is concerted opposition to Churchill and a vote of censure is brought forward.
And is one of the reasons it's so politically fraught and dangerous. If you take Singapore as an example, I think Churchill calls it the worst capitulation, the worst defeat in British history.
Yes.
Away from the war, this is also about the empire, right?
It is indeed, and the empire is crumbling in the Far East, and even India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, is menaced by the Japanese. One other disaster we didn't mention in 1942, of course, was something of a dress rehearsal for D-Day, the Dieppe raid.
Oh, yes.
An absolute disaster. Yeah. Stalin, ever since he'd been attacked, was putting on pressure for a second front now, in which he was supported very surprisingly perhaps, by one of the main contenders to take over from Churchill, Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian-born newspaper proprietor, press baron, literally, who led a campaign for Second Front Now, a pro-Russian campaign. And Soviet power had never, ever been more popular in Britain. There were mass rallies for Second Front Now, and this was another pressure on Churchill, who knew that we wouldn't be in a position to launch a Second Front for at least 2 years. And the the Dieppe raid, which was a minor dress rehearsal for Dieppe, for D-Day, had gone horribly wrong and resulted in huge, mainly Canadian casualties.
And in fact, all through the first 6 months as well, the Japanese are rampaging in the Indian Ocean with their carrier force. They've virtually annihilated the Royal Navy here, who've gone basically to Mombasa in Africa to stay out of the way. So the first half of 42 is complete disaster. And what makes it worse, of course, is because as well as being Prime Minister, he is his own Minister of Defence. And everybody says you're autocratic, you're windy, you haven't got the strategy right. Mm-hmm. And this group comes together, and essentially it's people like Hore Belisha. He had been Minister of War in 1940. Admiral Keyes, who was a hero from the First World War, a friend of Churchill, in fact, comes together with also Nye Bevan, a fairly trenchant Labour critic as well, and some discontented Tories. And they propose a vote of censure in July 1942. And it looks quite serious. Now,
so this is the first sort of direct challenge on his leadership.
Yeah. But what rather undermines it is Roger Keyes gets up and says, well, actually, it'll be a bit of a disaster if we get rid of Church because there's nobody else.
Yeah.
and the House votes, I think, that it's 475 to 25 to keep him in post.
Yeah.
So it has the effect of reinforcing him.
And one of the MPs who put forward the motion made an absolute fool of himself by proposing as the new commander of the British Army, the younger brother of the King, who was an absolute... Shall we say he makes Prince Harry look like an intellectual?
Well, let's have that conversation then. If we in 1940, if we assume rightly or wrongly, Halifax is probably the most obvious choice.
Yes.
In 42, who? Yeah, come on. Who is there?
There are a few candidates, but none of them have anything like...
You need to hear what Nigel was going to say. It was the Duke of Gloucester that they were proposing.
Yes, Henry, the Duke of Gloucester, whose favourite hobby was flicking pats of butter to see if they would stick on the ceiling. And this was the man who was proposed as the new commander of the British Army.
Just anything to pass the time.
That's right. So that rather destroyed it, along with Keyes saying, well, actually, we haven't got a choice now. So,
exactly.
So it rather reinforced his position. That was the key point.
What was more likely, I think, to remove Churchill was the Grim Reaper himself, because he was not a well man. He was in his mid-60s. He suffered during the war 3 bouts of pneumonia, which is a serious disease at any stage, but particularly known as the old man's friend, because it carried so many old men off. And
well, that suggests it's a young man's friend.
No, but what I mean is people suffering from a serious disease would be killed by pneumonia. But he also, while he was on one of his bridge-building visits to Washington, had a heart attack in
41,
while he was trying to close a window in the White House. Churchill was a lifelong heavy drinker, smoked cigars, as we know, smoked like a chimney, drank like a fish. He was a stranger to the gym, took next to no exercise, was small, fat and corpulent. And
well, he says nice things about you, though.
Indeed. A life well lived, I'm sure you could argue.
But he had an iron constitution and he lived to be 90 years old.
OK, we'll bring this...
And interestingly, some assassination attempts as well. Quite extraordinary. I mean, the Germans actually tried to insert some poisoned chocolate into the war cabinet rooms at one stage. Churchill himself, returning from America, was nearly shot down by 6 hurricanes, but they couldn't find the target. But became very close to it. There's also a very strange story in 1942 of essentially a civilian airliner that left Portugal, was coming to Britain, and it grew up after the war that the Luftwaffe thought that Churchill was on board, and they mistook, believe it or not, the agent of the actor Leslie Howard as being Churchill, because apparently he smoked cigars, he wore a Homburg and dressed and looked like him.
All the signifiers.
And essentially, it was intercepted by 8 Junkers 88 long-range fighters And the aircraft had previously avoided these, and they were quite confident they could outmaneuver them. But on this occasion, it was shot down. Now, for a long time after the war, it was thought to be a very clever German attempt to actually kill Churchill, rather like you'd see in a novel, but rather like The Eagle Has Landed, in fact. But it didn't really happen. I think they may have been targeting Leslie Howard, because this is the guy who was...
Why would they be targeting him?
Because he was a major part of our propaganda campaign in the Iberian Peninsula to keep Franco out. Mm-hmm. He was Ashley Wilkes in Gone with the Wind, of course. Everybody remembers that. And he was a passenger on this airliner. The only other time that Churchill came close to being killed in 1942 is he was departing in a flying boat from Virginia, and a crazed American tried to shoot him. And the Secret Service, in fact, I remember the name of the guy, his name was Mike Riley, actually stopped him being killed. So there was an attempt there.
So that's just out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So then, if we'll bring this section to a close, politically then, after that sort of vote of censure, 1942, is that kind of the last moment that it was...
Oh, yeah, because towards the end of the year, of course, you get the victory of El Alamein.
Yep.
You get Operation Torch, landing in North Africa. And he survives. And in fact, in his memoirs, Churchill actually says, if I had gone in 1942, people would have seen me as a real duffer, and everybody else would have got the credit afterwards. And he recognises 1942 as being the hinge. Certainly with the victory at El Alamein, which cancels out the victory by Rommel at Gazala earlier in the year, and everything then starts to go right, because Barbarossa, of course, swings round to the Russians actually then taking the initiative. You have Stalingrad, you have all sorts of things happen. And let's face it, out in the Pacific, you've had Midway, you've had Guadalcanal. The Allies are on the offensive everywhere at that point, and we're part of that.
OK, hold that thought, because how Churchill and his legacy is viewed is going to become a key point of our counterfactuals, because that is the real history of Winston Churchill's wartime career. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, time to get into what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves some really long-term questions. Had Winston Churchill not lasted throughout the war? I'm going to come to you first, Nigel, because we've talked about Lord Halifax a lot. We've talked about them perhaps not being many other suitors, say, in 1942 if Churchill falls then. But you do say there are people with leadership ambitions at the time.
There are, and there were obvious candidates and not so obvious candidates. The heir apparent to Churchill, who was recognised by Churchill as being the man who would step up into his shoes if anything should happen to him, as they say, was Anthony Eden, the young, glamorous Tory politician, wonderful record in World War I. He'd resigned from the government in 1937 over disagreeing with appeasement, basically, and stood at Churchill's side. He had his own group of followers known as the Glamour Boys, because he himself was a tall, handsome glamour boy himself, but known derisively by Chamberlain as the Glamour Boys. He had his own group, so he was an anti-appeaser likely rival of Churchill in 1940. He was in the government. Churchill brought him into the government as soon as he became Prime Minister. So he was probably the most obvious candidate. Then, as I've mentioned, there was Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian-born press lord, who very much in favour of the alliance with Russia. He'd done a sterling job as Minister of Aircraft Production, got housewives to give their saucepans to be converted into Spitfires, although that didn't really very much happen in reality. And then we have a left-wing contender for the post, Sir Stafford Cripps, rather like Tony Benn, a well-born, upper-class, extreme left socialist. And Churchill, as was his wont, got rid of him by sending him to be ambassador to Stalin's Russia.
So did Churchill again know that he was a threat?
Churchill actually quite liked Stafford Cripps, although he did make fun of him. He famously said, "There, but for the grace of God, goes God." He didn't like his socialism. He thought he was a bit of a hypocrite because Stafford Cripps was a teetotal vegetarian, high-living, plain-thinking man. And Stalin,
pretty unusual for the time.
Certainly not welcome at Churchill's dining table. And Churchill and Stalin, when they met, had a good giggle about the British ambassador, Stafford Cripps, who was a teetotaler and, as I say, high-minded socialist. And this was all a big laugh. So he was another possible candidate for the leadership. He was very popular at home among left-wing and progressive sides of the political equation. And finally, possibly the leader of the Labour Party and the de facto Deputy Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who basically ran the war domestically while Churchill was gallivanting around the world, winning the war internationally.
And we'll come back to him because he, of course, becomes Prime Minister in 1945.
I mean, the interesting thing about Attlee is Churchill lets it be known that he's not up to it, he thinks. He actually says his abilities are not equal to this position. It doesn't warrant it. He also says that his contribution to the fighting is nothing. So he has a very low opinion of Attlee's ability to take over.
An empty car draws up outside Downing Street and Mr Attlee gets out. He was alleged to have said that, although he did respect Attlee for his fine war record in the First World War.
Yeah. So what does he have him around for?
Well, because he needs the Labour Party on side. And it's quite significant that when he gets rid of Arthur Greenwood from the cabinet, he specifically...
For being a drunk.
Yeah, well, for being useless as well. He actually, and they've been trying to get rid of him for a long time. That's when he says, "You're Deputy Prime Minister." It's never authorised by the King.
Yeah.
It's an unofficial post, but it boosts basically the support from the Labour Party and of course Bevan as well, who's the other very powerful powerful figure in the government at this stage. There's one other possibility that started in 1940 that was put together by Sir John Colville and also by the King to bring Jan Smuts, the Boer general, and basically founder member of the League of Nations, international Commonwealth statesman, to bring him in on top to take over if Churchill actually disappears in a flash. And everybody forgets about this. And Smuts, of course, a very capable performer.
Yeah, so he wouldn't have been from the more appeasement camp of Halifax.
No, but it's greatly ironic. A man who made his name fighting against the British Empire in the Boer War should, by the Second World War, be regarded as an uber-loyal supporter of the British Empire.
It's even closer than that. He was the district commander where Churchill was captured during the Boer War.
Yeah.
It's quite extraordinary. Yeah.
But just getting back to Attlee, I think we should remember that both Attlee and Ernest Bevin, the thing against them succeeding is they were fanatically loyal to Churchill. They were loyal cabinet colleagues to him. They never plotted against him. The plots against Churchill came from the Tory party and outside the cabinet. They didn't come from Labour.
The other thing I think, Fergus, worth mentioning is that the country actually is trending towards Labour during the war. Everybody's surprised by the 1945 election. But if you look at the by-elections during the war, there's one at Malden in Essex, famously, which has always been Tory. Yeah, and Tom Dryburgh is elected there. So all the time, Labour are building their position within this coalition domestically. That's the key point. And as you say, Cripps himself, who's so far left that even the Labour Party expel him, it's building throughout the war.
OK, but is that the perils of incumbency? Say, in our scenario, if you do get Cripps becoming a wartime leader at some point, do you then still get the Attlee 1945 government and period of regeneration?
Well,
definitely.
Not Attlee.
With the Cripps.
But you would get, I think, a Labour government. Because
you trust the British electorate not to change leader?
No, because it was trending that way anyway, I think, throughout the war. And I'm always surprised when people say, and I think, Nigel, you and I agree on this, that the vote in 45 was not against Churchill, it was against the Conservative Party.
Yes, and
that's the key point.
And for Labour, Labour were getting to be very popular. There was a feeling that the country needed to change from the high unemployment, the misery of the 1930s, and Labour was the party to do it, and the tired old Tories. There hadn't been an election since 1935, by 1945, for 10 years, and that is a very long time. OK,
I'm going to take us back to 1940 and some of those counterfactuals we posited at the start, whether Churchill dies in the Blitz, or perhaps whether his plane is shot down by the Germans on the way to France. I might be being naive, but I find it hard to imagine if Churchill was killed in that way, Britain would then want to go more to a policy of appeasement. We'd want to fight on, would we not? If our leader had been killed by the enemy?
Depends when it happens. If he's killed, if he's shot down going back and forth to France, you're almost certainly going to see either a return of Chamberlain at that point, despite what the Labour Party think, because the majority is huge. The Conservative majority is huge in the House of Commons at that point. Or you're going to see Halifax coming in because, for want of anybody better at that point. That's the key thing. And I would have thought...
And he'd still sue for peace, do you think, in that Halifax?
I think Chamberlain would have carried on.
OK.
Yeah, because I think the scales fell from Chamberlain's eyes. I mean, he comes back from Munich and he actually says, look, Hitler, he's not like us. He suddenly realises he's not the guy. And I think, you get fooled once, you don't get fooled twice. So if Chamberlain had taken over, I think you would have continued the fight. But of course, he dies towards the end of the year. So you're then back in with that problem again. I mean, I think my own view, I think, I don't know what you think, Nigel, is people like Beaverbrook would have started to assert themselves then and said, look, I understand what's going on. We've got war production. We've won the Battle of Britain. It's my production that's done that. And I think the momentum would have been with Beaverbrook and also Churchill's little inner circle. Yeah. And I think there would have been momentum to continue. But again, Beaverbrook's in the Lords. Who do you actually run the Commons with?
I'm not at all sure that Beaverbrook would have fought on. Don't forget, he was a strong appeaser. The Daily Express came out with the headline, "There will be no war," at the beginning of 1939. As we know, he wasn't really an ideological supporter of Churchill. He was a sort of opportunist, I would say, which is why he supported Soviet Russia when they came into the war. And
but if you have Chamberlain continuing, the momentum through the Battle of Britain, you've had Beaverbrook as head of production and things like that. By that stage, you're pretty much in it, and the momentum is going forward. My question would be is, who comes in, if you've got Beaverbrook, who can't operate from the Lords, who comes in at that point? That's the issue.
Only Eden, I think. Eden is the only possibility.
And if we do continue with Chamberlain or someone else, I mean, they're going to also operate Britain's role in the war in a totally different way to Churchill.
Well, yeah, your relationship with America is not the same. That's the first thing. So do the Americans draw back a bit and say, well, actually, it's not our fight? And you've got Joseph Kennedy as the ambassador saying that they're not going to win. Don't bother supporting them. Roosevelt, of course, has an election. So he's in that space at the moment. So he's got to think about that. My sense is that the Americans would have been focused on the Pacific and China at that point. Not Japan per se, but what's going on in China, Manchuria, their open China policy, extending their reach, obviously, over the Philippines and things like that. All their war plans envisaged the Pacific was going to be their primary theatre. And I just wonder if they leave us to it at this point, if you've got anybody other than Churchill.
You in agreement?
Yes, and I think that this gives impetus to the central point that we're all discussing, how much actually depended on the personality of Winston Churchill. The fact that this war leader, and had he been removed from the scene, either by accident, by death, whatever, or by a vote of no confidence, the whole picture would have absolutely changed, and the outcome of the war before 1941 would have been different, I think.
I think the other thing, Fergus, is you've got to look at the eloquence and the sheer energy that Churchill puts into the relationship with the Americans. He bypasses Halifax.
Yes.
Halifax is virtually a non-entity in Washington. So he has to generate all this.
He's doing it from a long time before they enter the war as well, right?
Indeed. But during the war, he keeps cultivating this relationship, keeps sending telegrams, keeps on the case. And you can see as I said, the eloquence of the language, how he appeals to Roosevelt. So without that personality there, you're thinking, how do the dry as dust Foreign Office and the Dominion Office and the Colonial Office actually deal with this?
He walks around the White House in the nude and says to Roosevelt, the Prime Minister of Britain has got nothing to hide from the President of the United States. He does these sort of things. It is very much dependent on his eccentric and attractive personality.
It's performance politics.
So without Churchill, no special relationship at all?
I worry about America's entry into the war, to tell you the truth, if that relationship isn't in place. Remember, he's already negotiated before Pearl Harbor that if America enters the war, it will be Germany first.
Yeah.
They've already negotiated that, and the Atlantic Treaty has taken place at this stage. Roosevelt, as I hinted earlier, thinks he's going to have to go to war with Germany eventually. But when you've got Japan in the Pacific...
And they were the ones who physically attacked America at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Is there at all a scenario where if Churchill is assassinated or indirectly assassinated in the Blitz, then America actually comes on side much earlier? So we've seen no?
No, I think at this point, Joseph Kennedy on the megaphone says it's all over for us. I mean, remember, Churchill made the decision about Mazer el-Kabir, attacking the French fleet. And even the Royal Navy said, we're not easy with this. It's not something we want to do. And so Admiral Somerville said, it's the worst thing I ever had to do in the war. And so that sort of ruthless decision is made by Churchill alone. Nobody else makes that decision. So he needs to be there for that. And you look at, he is the man of the hour. You know, at any other time, he might not have been the right person, but he is at this point. And he drags the Americans across. What people underestimate, I think, is the extent to which the Americans were actually involved in the Battle of the Atlantic in 1940. So you've actually, as I said, got them creating these security zones. They actually say to U-boats, within this zone, if you attack any ship, we're going to attack you. And Raeder, the head of the German Navy, said, this isn't fair. It really doesn't work. And of course, the German Navy, when Germany declares war on America, goes, yippee, send the U-boats to the East Coast. They're off. Operation Drumbeat.
Does it, this is obviously the big counterfactual, does it fundamentally change the outcome of the war if you lose Churchill? And depending on when?
I think it does if he went quite early on, not if he went later. than 1941.
So 42 is still...
Yeah. I think once America, well, maybe once Russia was in, but once America was in the war, it was just a question of time.
Where it does alter is the post-war settlement. Because I think at this point, whoever succeeds Churchill, I would say, doesn't go to Tehran. He doesn't go to Yalta. He probably doesn't go to Potsdam because you don't count.
No.
Because
you don't have that.
Between America and the Soviet Union, we're running this. And so that's where it makes a difference, I think, is that Churchill is very careful to impose himself into these conferences and say, we count. So if you take it all the way through, that probably would have meant that Britain wouldn't be a permanent member of the Security Council now.
Wow, still today.
One caveat against that is that it wasn't just Britain, it was the British Empire.
That's true.
We're talking about India, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand and Australia and certain Caribbean countries as well. So it wasn't just little England, it was Great Britain and the British Empire.
But without Churchill's desire to maintain the empire, so you're looking in 44, 45, he insists on sending the British Pacific Fleet out there to help the Americans in a little way. I mean, the Americans were way outnumbered and outclassed us. But the fact of life is he needed that fingerprint on the ground to make sure that we had an interest, a seat at the table, and that the Americans and the Soviets weren't going to say, this is how we're going to run the world after this. So staying in the game is quite important. But even by Yalta, even Churchill himself is starting to be sidelined by, you look at the body language in some of the pictures, by Stalin and by Roosevelt.
So just on personally for Winston Churchill, it will change our kind of image of him, whether he was taken out politically or whether he was killed during the war. But obviously we're talking kind of up to 1942 mostly in this conversation. Even if he's killed pre-1942, does that change our image of him? Because he hasn't had any of his successes. Does he become a forgotten man of history?
I don't think so. I think the fact that his speeches kept Britain going in 1940 is what we primarily remember him now. And I think we would have primarily... In fact, death would have probably lent a certain martyrdom.
But do you need what comes after that to make those speeches important? Or
no, I mean, Churchill was a very diminished figure. When he came back to power in 1951, you know, he was having strokes. He was an old man nearing 80 years old. I think his golden hour, his hour of fame and glory, would have still resonated in history, whether he'd died or whether he'd lived. In a certain sense, the post-war years were sad because he was an old, dying man. It was a very long death. You know, he survived until 1965 for another 20 years after the war. But I think his hour of destiny was 1940.
Bizarrely, there was somebody else who was very eloquent, who was standing in the wings in 1940, and people were talking about him coming back, and that was David Lloyd George.
Oh,
in the First World War.
Indeed.
And he's the forgotten man at this time, because at the time his rhetoric is soaring at this stage, and he thinks he's in with a chance of actually making a comeback. So we might have got somebody else with similar... He didn't have a chance politically, because obviously he's not a Conservative at that stage, but he was knocking on the door in 1940.
Unlike his successful run in power in the First World War, Lloyd George was an appeaser. He'd gone and sucked up to Hitler in Berchtesgaden. He actually thought we were going to lose the war up to quite a late stage. And he was an old man as well. He was older than Churchill. He was a decade older than Churchill. He died in the last year of the war. So he did have a moment of glory in the famous Norway debate, which brought Chamberlain down. He made a speech against the government because he absolutely hated Chamberlain, called him a pinhead, and said he'd make a good Lord Mayor of Birmingham in a very mediocre year.
I think the other important thing about Churchill is, of course, his role as a writer.
Yeah.
So quite a lot of the history that we're talking about here, Churchill famously said, you know, I will be remembered by history because I intend to write it. Yeah. And he has this soaring Nobel laureate winning way of writing, not just about the war, but also his previous life, but the history of the English-speaking peoples. So his imprint, basically, which was sort of started here, continued after the war on the back of this reputation here. So had he gone in 1940, for example, or even 1942, you probably wouldn't have had that sort of eminence in terms of writing. He'd have written, but I don't think you'd have had that elevated
I've got one more
rhetoric.
Little counterfactual to throw out for you. If he goes in 1940, Britain, of course, still has the Royal Navy and the RAF, but without Churchill, did the Germans maybe think Operation Sea Lion might be more of a goer?
No. No. I mean, the German Navy is saying throughout, look, we'll go through the motions, but we don't want to do this. And the Army are saying it's only a river crossing, and the Navy is saying 20-mile wide river crossing? Yeah, right. But, you know, after Norway, the German Navy is not in a fit state to protect a transit across the Channel. The Luftwaffe has a go, of course, in the Battle of Britain. That doesn't work. Hitler's never really a fan of this. No. He never is.
He called himself a coward, a hero on the land and a coward at sea, didn't he?
And was and always seasick when he went to sea. Yeah. He purposely never went on the water. So he didn't like the idea, but it kept the Kriegsmarine occupied as they were rebuilding. Very significant. He put Admiral Lutyens, his best admiral, operational admiral, in charge of that. But I don't think ever considered that they were going to do it. That was the point. It was a way of putting pressure on Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the point.
Final thought from both of you. Are we saying in all of these counterfactuals, we've been through so many in this episode, Germany still lose the war, ultimately?
Well, it depends. Once Barbarossa starts and Barbarossa is held, then I think you're losing the war at that point. Yes. In fact, Churchill said that, didn't he? He said, if Moscow falls, we've got a problem. If it doesn't, we're OK. And certainly after Pearl Harbor. And I think Churchill himself said, you know what? After I heard about Pearl Harbor, I went to bed
and slept well.
And slept the sleep of the just. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think those two turning points really end. I mean, the danger to Britain is still there. I mean, we mustn't forget that the Germans could have actually said, you know what? We'll hold in the east and we'll finish off Britain. And they could have done, actually, before the Americans built up.
Absolutely fascinating. So many counterfactuals there, like I say. So what happens if Churchill fell during the war? It really, really depends on exactly when he fell. If it was in 1940, for example, does Britain sue for peace, like we've covered before? Does it fight on under a new leader? Almost certainly that relationship with America without Churchill doesn't develop. Are Britain even in the UN Security Council today? Do America pursue a Pacific First strategy? And what happens with Barbarossa? I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Nigel Jones for joining me. We'll be back undoing more history very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And you can also listen and follow the show as a podcast. Just search for History Undone in your podcast apps. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.